The Brother Who Was Not My Brother, a dramatic narrative narrated in the first person by Lucien Voss. The captor speaks. Part 1, the candy. She gave me a piece of candy on the night of the first snow. I was 11 years old. The Beaumont family had taken me in 3 weeks earlier, and I had been conducting the specific audit of a new household. The children in my situation always conduct the careful and comprehensive assessment of every person and every room and every relationship, the mapping of power and warmth and danger and alliance, the inventory that a child raised in institutions performs because without it the world is not navigable. The Beaumont household was, by the measures available to me, a good one. The parents, Philippe and Catherine, were people of specific and real warmth. The warmth of people who have chosen to take in a child because they genuinely want another child rather than because they want the performance of generosity. They were busy, they were professionals, a civil engineer and a pianist, and their household had the quality of a household organized around two people's serious work. But the warmth was there. I catalogued it, assessed it, and decided it was real. Their daughter was 8 years old. Her name was Isabel. She had her mother's coloring and her father's way of watching things. She was, when I arrived, in the process of deciding what I was. Not deciding whether to accept me, she had decided that on the first day, with the specific and unself-conscious openness of a child who has not yet learned to be cautious about people, she was deciding what category I belonged to, which is the more interesting question. She decided I was a project. She followed me around the house in the first week with the specific persistence of someone who has identified something interesting and intends to understand it. She told me which bakery on the Rue des Archives sold the best brioche. She told me the names of all the cats in the neighborhood and their histories. She showed me her collection of drawings, which she kept in a flat folder under her bed and which were, for an 8-year-old, genuinely specific, not pretty drawings, drawings of things she had observed and was trying to understand: the way a bird's wing worked, the pattern of tile on the church floor, the quality of her mother's hands at the piano. I watched her show me these, and I thought, this one pays attention. On the night of the first snow in November, I was sitting in the kitchen, unable to sleep. The kitchen was where I went when I could not sleep, because it was warm and because it smelled of the dinners Catherine made, and because being in the kitchen of a house that has fed you is a specific comfort that I had not previously had access to and that I was still learning to receive. Isabel came downstairs. She was in her pajamas, with her hair in the 2 braids she always slept in, and she was carrying something in her closed fist that she held out to me when she reached the kitchen doorway. She said, "I heard you come down. I brought something." She opened her fist. A piece of hard candy, the kind wrapped in cellophane, the kind that comes in a bowl on a grandmother's sideboard. She had been keeping it in her room. I said, "Where did you get that?" She said, "Mamie gave it to me at Christmas last year. I have been saving it for when I needed it." I said, "You saved Christmas candy for 11 months. She said, "I thought maybe I would need it. And then I never needed it, and I forgot about it, and I found it today." She pushed it toward me. I looked at it. I looked at her. She was 8 years old, and she had found me in the kitchen at midnight and had brought me the piece of candy she had been saving for 11 months. I took it. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome." Then she went back upstairs. I sat in the kitchen with the candy in my palm, and I understood for the first time in my life what it felt like to receive something from someone who had nothing to gain from giving it. That is where it started. That is the moment that made everything else possible and everything else necessary. Part 2, who I was. I want to tell you who I was before the Beaumont family, because the person I was explains the person I became, and the person I became is the person telling you this. I grew up in state institutions in the eastern suburbs of Lyon. Not one institution, several, because the systems that manage children who do not have families are organized around movement rather than stability, the logic of temporary placement rather than permanent home. I moved 7 times between the ages of 4 and 11 across 5 different facilities, each with its own culture and its own population of children who were like me in the process of being managed by a system that had good intentions and insufficient resources. I was not mistreated. I want to say this clearly, because the easy narrative about children from institutional backgrounds is that they were mistreated, and sometimes that is true, but it is not the only thing that produces the kind of person I became. I was housed and fed and schooled, and in most of the places I lived, I was treated with the kind of decent, impersonal care that the people responsible for me had the capacity to provide. I was not abused, but I was alone, not in the physical sense. I was surrounded by people in every facility, I lived in, other children, staff social workers, the peripheral figures who appeared at intervals to assess my situation and write reports about my development. I was surrounded by all of these people, and I was fundamentally and comprehensively alone in the specific sense of being unknown by any of them at a level that mattered. The loneliness of institutions is a specific kind of loneliness. It is the loneliness of someone who knows that their presence in a space is contingent, that they are there until the system decides they should be somewhere else, that the relationships they form are subject to dissolution without their consent. It is the loneliness of someone for whom nothing is permanent and nothing is theirs. I learned to manage this, not to feel less of it. The feeling was always there and is still there in some form, but to operate around it, to build the specific capabilities that this environment developed, which were the capabilities of someone who reads other people accurately, because reading people accurately is survival, who keeps their own counsel, because sharing it with the wrong person carries risk, who maintains a surface that produces the response they need, because the surface is a tool. I was very good at the surface. By 11, I had it perfected, the specific presentation of a well-behaved and grateful child that was the thing the institutional system rewarded and that I had learned to produce with complete reliability. The social workers who assessed me used words like resilient and emotionally intelligent and mature for his age, which were all accurate observations of the surface, and none of them were inaccurate and none of them described what was underneath. Underneath was the inventory. The permanent internal catalogue of everything and everyone in every room I'd ever been in, updated, continuously assessed for threat and opportunity, and the specific information that was useful to have. Underneath was the absence, the specific, hollow quality of a life that has not had a single sustained, chosen permanent relationship in it, the quality that becomes over time, something you stop being able to name because you have never had the thing the name refers to. And underneath both of these, something I did not have a name for and could not fully identify, something that arrived in small moments without being invited, the quality of the light coming through a specific window on a specific morning, the way a cat moved across a courtyard, the way a person's face looked when they were laughing at something that had genuinely surprised them. These small things arrested me. I did not know why. I catalogued them the way I catalogued everything, because the cataloguing was what I did with things I could not otherwise process. When Isabel gave me the candy, the thing underneath both of the other things recognized something, not in any language I could have used at the time, but recognized. That was the beginning. Part 3. The years of performing. The first 3 years in the Beaumont household were the years in which I performed the version of myself that was required. This is not as cynical as it sounds. The performance was genuine in the ways that performances become genuine when they have been sustained long enough, when the muscles involved in maintaining a posture have been exercising for long enough that the posture becomes the body's natural position. I was respectful and diligent and helpful, and I was good at school with the specific goodness of someone who understands that academic excellence is a form of currency and who acquires currency as a primary survival strategy. I was, in all the ways that were observable, a good foster son. Philippe and Catherine were good parents to me. I want to say this because it is true, and because the saying of it is part of the honesty this account requires. They brought me into their home, not as a charity project, but as a person they had decided to make room for, and they made the room genuinely. They attended my school events. They asked about my interests with the genuine curiosity of people who are learning another person. They included me in the family holidays to the Beaumont family house in Brittany, the specific inclusion of inviting someone to the most personal space rather than only the public one. I received all of this with the specific internal quality of someone who is receiving things that are real, but who does not have the architecture to hold them in the way they are meant to be held. I received them, and I catalogued them, and they produced in me something that was not quite gratitude and was not quite trust and was something else, something I have spent years trying to name accurately. Isabel was the constant. She had finished deciding what category I belonged to sometime in the second week after my arrival, and had settled without announcement on the category of brother, not as a label she applied or as a role she assigned, but as the simple fact of how she conducted herself toward me, which was the way younger siblings conduct themselves toward older ones when the relationship is genuine, with the specific mix of admiration and irritation and the complete assumption that you are there and will remain there. She showed me everything. Every book she was reading, every drawing she was making, every observation she had had that day about something she could not explain. She argued with me about things with the complete investment of someone who needs to resolve the argument rather than simply win it. She was in the first years the only person in my life whose behavior toward me did not seem to be governed by any assessment of utility or category. I did not know what to do with this. I catalogued it, I watched it, I tried to understand what it was and what it meant and what the correct response to it was. And somewhere in the cataloguing, something happened that I had not anticipated. I began to care what happened to her, not strategically, not in the way of someone who has identified a relationship as useful and who maintains it for the maintenance of the useful status. I began to care in the way that the thing underneath the surface and the absence recognized her and moved toward her in the specific way of something that has been still for a long time and has found a direction. At 12, I would have said she is the person in this house who matters most to me. At 13, I would have said she is the person in my life who matters most. At 14, I would have said nothing because by 14, I had understood that whatever this was, it was not something I could say to anyone without producing consequences I could not predict or control. At 14, I began to manage the distance between what I felt and what I showed. This is where the error started. Part 4, the management of distance. I want to be precise about what happened over the next 4 years from 14 to 18, because precision is what this story demands. I did not harm her, not in the ways I had been capable of harming things in earlier years, the calculated cruelties of a child who has learned that the only power available is the power to damage. Those years were over. I had moved past them. What happened instead was something different and in some ways more damaging in its effect, though it produced no visible evidence. I managed her, not overtly, not in any single decision or action that could have been identified as harmful, through the accumulated small decisions of someone who has identified the thing that matters most to them and who has begun instinctively and without full self-awareness to organize the environment around the protection and the maintenance of that thing. I was aware of everyone who approached Isabel with the kind of interest that might become significant, not in the jealous way or not exactly in the way of someone who has never had a permanent relationship and who has for the first time something that feels like one, and who is responding to any perceived threat with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom threat assessment is a deeply ingrained skill. There was a girl at school named Claire who was Isabel's closest friend in the year they were both 15 and 14, respectively. Claire was generous and warm and specifically good for Isabel in the ways that certain friendships are specifically good, the kind that challenges you rather than simply affirming you, that makes you think about things differently. I watched this friendship and I watched what it did to Isabel, which was to make her laugh more and to bring her home with specific energy and to produce in her a quality of investment in her own separate life that I had not seen before. I did not like this. I did not do anything about it. I want to be specific about this. I did not say anything to Isabel about Claire. I did not manufacture evidence or create situations. What I did was something less visible and in some ways more difficult to defend against because it had no single moment that could be pointed to as the moment it happened. I shifted. Over weeks, I became slightly less available to Isabel, which made her come to me more, which produced in her a minor and barely conscious anxiety about the reliability of the relationship that made the separate connection with Claire feel slightly less secure by comparison. I became slightly more present when Claire was around, not in any uncomfortable way, but in the specific way that someone who understands social dynamics can be present in a way that shifts the atmosphere of a space without anyone being able to say what had shifted. It worked. The friendship with Claire diminished not dramatically, but through the natural process of drift that happens when someone is slightly more available in one direction than in another. Isabel did not register this as anything except the natural change in friendships over time. Claire moved on to other things. The drift was complete. I felt, when this was done, something I am ashamed of now and will not pretend otherwise. I felt satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of someone who has managed a situation that was producing discomfort. This was the error. Not the thing I did to Claire, though, that was wrong. The error was the satisfaction, because the satisfaction meant that I had confirmed to myself that managing Isabel's environment was something I was going to do when I felt the need, and having confirmed this to myself, I would do it again. I did it again. Over the next 3 years, I did it again with 2 other friends and with a boy at school who had shown an interest in Isabel that she had not discouraged, and with the specific person at the university she began at 18 who, what I assessed, had been genuinely good for her. By the time she was 19 and our parents died in the accident on the road to Brittany, the circle of people genuinely available to her had contracted to almost nothing. I had done this, not with violence, not with any single dramatic action, through the prescient and continuous application of a skill that I had been developing since I was 4 years old and that I had been deploying in the service of a feeling I could not name correctly. After the accident with the circle already contracted and our parents gone, I had what I had been building toward for 8 years. I had her completely. And what I discovered when I had her completely was that it was not what I had been working toward. What I discovered was the specific quality of a thing that has been achieved through the wrong means and that therefore cannot be what you wanted it to be. I had built a cage, not for her, for the thing I felt for her, and the cage was the cage. Part 5. The inheritance. Our parents left a will. I had seen an early draft of this will 2 years before the accident, in the context of managing the estate of my parents' household after Philippe's illness scare. The will had a specific provision regarding my guardianship of Isabel in the event of their deaths before she was 25, and had not established independent residence. I want to be honest about this provision. I did not write it into the will. I would not have done this because I am not that person, and also because I am not that stupid. What I did was review a draft of the will at Philippe's request and note in my review that the guardianship provision was missing and that given Isabel's age and their ages and the general principle of estate planning, it seemed like a reasonable thing to include. He agreed. He added it. I did not suggest my own name. He suggested it, which I accepted. This is a morally meaningful distinction, and it does not change the fact that the provision was in the will because I had identified the gap and noted it, and that I had identified the gap because I had been thinking at 21 years old about the specific scenario in which they were both gone, and Isabel had no legal protection against the version of me that existed. I want to be clear that I did not plan their deaths. I will say this once, and I will not say it again, because saying it more than once suggests defensiveness, and defensiveness suggests guilt. I did not cause the accident on the road to Brittany. The accident was an accident in the specific terrible sense of things that happen without intent and without anyone being the cause. What I had done was build the structure that meant I was positioned when the accident occurred to step into the space the accident created. This distinction matters morally. It does not change the outcome. After the accident, I moved Isabel into the apartment in the 7th arrondissement. I organized the estate with the efficiency of someone who had been thinking about this for years and had all the relevant information available. I managed the grief with the same efficiency. And in the weeks after the accident in the apartment, I understood clearly what I had built and what I had become in the building of it. She was 19 years old and her parents were dead and she had almost no one. She had me, and she had me because I'd made sure there was no one else, and the understanding of this produced in me something I had not experienced before in the forms I had experienced other things. Horror. Not at myself, not at first, not in the simple way that word implies. At the mechanism. At the thing I had been doing for 8 years and had not fully seen until the moment I saw its complete result. The circle contracted to almost nothing. The people gone. The house and the will and the apartment and the girl who was 23 years old and alone with me. I had done this with patient and precise and complete intent. I sat with this for a long time. And then I made the mistake that I have been living with since. Part 6, the medication. The medication was a mistake. I want to say this plainly, because the plainness is what it deserves. It was not a sophisticated plan. It was not something I had designed in advance with the patience I brought to other things. It was a decision made in a crisis moment, in the specific moment when I understood what I had built and understood that what I had built was not sustainable in its current form, that the person in front of me was going to understand eventually what had happened, and when she understood she was going to be terrified. And terrified, people do unpredictable things. I needed time. I told myself I needed time to think about how to undo what I had done, or at least how to give it a form that was less obviously what it was. I told myself the medication was temporary, which is what people tell themselves when they do something they cannot justify by any other means. It was not temporary. Once you have done something like that, the stopping of it requires a form of courage that I did not have, because the stopping of it means the person in front of you is going to come back to themselves and understand what was done, and then you will have to stand in front of their understanding. The chain was also a mistake, also made in a crisis moment, also told to myself as temporary, also not temporary. I am not going to explain these mistakes in terms that make them comprehensible as the decisions of a reasonable person, because they are not the decisions of a reasonable person. They are the decisions of someone who has been moving toward a specific destination for a very long time and who has arrived at the destination and found it to be wrong and who does not know how to stop moving. I had built the cage for the thing I felt. I had built it out of 8 years of patient work. And when the cage was complete and I was inside it with her, I understood what I should have understood much earlier, which was that cages are not for feelings. Cages are for the fear of losing things. What I had built was not the thing I wanted. What I wanted was the candy on the night of the first snow, the 8-year-old who had saved Christmas candy for 11 months and brought it to the lonely 11-year-old in the kitchen at midnight. That person, that quality, that specific and unasked for gift, you cannot chain that. You can only destroy it by trying. Part 7. The day she left. She left on a Thursday morning in January. I knew she was going before she went, not because I had been monitoring her, though I had, because I know how to read a situation, and the situation had been telling me something for 3 weeks, the specific quality of attention she was paying to small things, the quality of attention that had always been hers and that I had spent the past months trying to suppress with the medication. And that was coming back. She had been pouring the milk into the plant. I noticed this from the specific quality of the plant's decline and recovery, the specific timeline that corresponded to the days I had and had not been present to observe. She had been managing me for 3 weeks. I had let her, because watching her manage me was the first sign I had had that the person underneath was still there. And I wanted her to still be there more than I wanted the management to succeed. Mark Ober had been to the apartment 2 days before. I knew what the visit meant. Mark had been watching me from a professional distance for 2 years, and I had allowed him to watch because stopping him from watching would have produced exactly the kind of incident that I had been avoiding. He was a person of integrity, in the specific and professional sense, the person who was going to do what integrity required when integrity required something. When I came home on the Thursday and found her gone, and the letter on the desk, I sat in the chair by the window for a long time. The letter said many things. I will not tell you all of them because they are hers. But there is one thing she said that I have carried since. She said, "You cannot love the real version of a person by imprisoning them. You can only love the copy you have made of them, and copies do not love back." I sat with this for the rest of the day and the night. She was right. She had been right from the beginning, from the moment she was 8 years old and showed me her drawings and told me about the bakery and waited to see what category I belonged to. She had been right about everything, and what she was right about was not something that could be argued with because it was not an argument. It was the truth stated plainly, by the specific person who had always stated things plainly when they mattered. I am trained as a physician. I understand the specific damage that what I did can cause, and I understand it not in the abstract, but in the specific way of someone who has spent years studying the mechanisms of the mind and its vulnerabilities. I understand what I gave her in that milk and what it cost her and what the chain cost her and what the 8 years before both of them cost her. I understand all of this. Understanding it is not the same as being able to undo it. The only thing available on the other side of understanding is what you do with it. Part 8. What happened next? The legal consequences were significant. I will not describe them in detail because the description is not the point of this account and because the relevant people, Mark and the appropriate authorities, have their own records that are more complete and more accurate than anything I would write about them. What I will tell you is that I cooperated completely, not because I was required to, not because cooperation produced a better outcome, but because cooperation was the only thing available that was honest, and honesty is the thing I owe her. My medical license was suspended during the investigation. This is appropriate. I began treatment, the specific kind of treatment for the specific kind of person I am, the kind that requires a certain amount of sitting with things you have been managing around for years, and which therefore produces the specific discomfort of encountering your own interior without the management. I have been in treatment for 14 months. The treatment has given me one thing that I did not have before. Not resolution, not peace with what I did. Those are not things that are available to someone who has done what I did and who understands what they did. What it has given me is the specific capacity to look at the 11-year-old in the kitchen without the subsequent years intervening, to see him clearly, separately from what he became as the specific small person he was, who had been alone for so long. He had catalogued everything and felt almost nothing, and who received a piece of candy and understood for the first time what it felt like for someone to give without expectation of return. That 11-year-old understood something real and true. He understood it completely and accurately. What he did not have, what I did not have, was the architecture to hold what he understood correctly, to receive it without organizing around the keeping of it, to let it be given without immediately beginning the work of ensuring it could not be taken. The treatment is teaching me the architecture, slowly, in the way of things that require the specific labor of undoing years of alternative construction. I do not know if I will reach the point where the architecture is right. I am working toward it. Part 9, the letter I wrote. I wrote her a letter 4 months after she left. 4 months, because that was the amount of time it took me to write something that was honest rather than managed, which is the specific labor of a person who has been managing things all his life, trying to produce something that is not managed. The letter took 11 drafts. Each one failed in a specific way. The first was too explanatory, the explanation organized to produce a specific response. The second was too brief, the brevity, a form of withholding that I recognized as another management strategy. The third through eighth drafts each had something wrong in the specific place where I was trying to say the thing I most needed to say, which is the place where managed writing always fails. The ninth draft was the one that was honest. I recognized it because reading it produced in me the specific discomfort of something that could not be adjusted to produce a better response. It was the truth, as I understood it, and it could not be improved, only changed, and changing it would make it less true. I sent it. I did not know if she would read it. I did not know what she would do with it. I had arranged the letter to make no demands, which I hoped would come through in the reading as genuine rather than as another strategy. Whether it did, I do not know. What I know is that I said the version of you that was always going to survive was real. I saw it in the quality of your attention to small things, the light, the plant, the way you watched things from the time you were 8 years old and showed me drawings of a bird's wing and the pattern of tile on a church floor, trying to understand how things worked. I know that the thing I had for you was real from the night you gave me the candy. I know that the real thing and the harm I did are not opposites. They are the same thing viewed from different angles, which is the most difficult thing I have had to sit with. I know that you're going to be all right, not because I know your circumstances, but because I know the quality of your attention. And the quality of your attention has always been the thing that survives. Part 10, the candy. I keep it in the drawer of my desk. The specific wrapper. I have had it since I was 11 years old. Cellophane, small, the hard candy that comes in a bowl on a grandmother's sideboard. Christmas candy saved for 11 months by an 8-year-old who thought maybe she would need it and then brought it to a lonely 11-year-old at midnight on the night of the first snow. I have moved several times. The wrapper has moved with me because it is the physical record of the moment that made everything possible and everything else necessary. I look at it sometimes, not with the feeling that things went wrong from that point, with the feeling that the thing that started in that moment was real and was the right thing, and that everything that went wrong, not because of the candy, but because of the absence of the architecture to hold what the candy meant. The architecture is what you build by being in relationship with people over time, and by learning in that time that other people's presence is not something that has to be managed and maintained, that it can simply be allowed to be what it is. I did not know this at 11. I did not know it at 20. I am learning it now. The therapy is slow, and the learning is slow, and the specific labor of rebuilding a self that was constructed around the wrong things is the longest and the most difficult thing I have done. But I am doing it. I am doing it because she gave me a piece of candy at midnight, and the 11-year-old who received it understood something true, and what that 11-year-old understood deserves to be honored, not by possessing the thing that gave the understanding, but by becoming the kind of person who can receive the next gift without destroying it. That is what I'm working toward. It is enough to be working toward it. It is the only thing available. Epilogue, what I know now. There is a courtyard visible from the window of the apartment I have been renting for the past year. It is in the 14th arrondissement, not far from the park, where I understand Isabel went once, and sat on a bench and ate an orange, and found it very good. In the courtyard, there is a pot on a ledge with rosemary in it. Someone tends it. I have seen them from the window occasionally. An older man with the specific, careful movements of someone who tends plants because they find the tending itself meaningful rather than because they want the rosemary for anything. I watch him tend it sometimes from my window. I think about the 11-year-old who catalogued everything and the specific quality of the things he catalogued. The light on certain mornings, the way a cat moved, the way a person's face looked when they laughed at something genuinely surprising. I think about what those moments were, what they were trying to tell him, about what was available in the world outside the inventory and the management and the surface. They were trying to tell him that beauty exists without being claimed, that the light coming through the window is not a resource to be managed, it is a thing to be present for. He did not know how to receive this. I am learning how, slowly, in the fourth-floor apartment with the courtyard and the rosemary, in the therapy on Tuesday mornings, in the specific daily practice of sitting with things without immediately cataloguing them, without assessing threat, without reaching for the management. The candy wrapper is in the drawer. It is the record of the last true thing. The next true thing is still being assembled. I am here. I am learning. That is all I have to offer. It is what there is. End. The Brother Who Was Not My Brother is an original dramatic narrative set in Lyon and Paris, France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual organizations or events is entirely coincidental. Additional chapter, The Year of the Drawings. I want to tell you about the year I was 13 and Isabel was 10 because it is the year I remember most clearly, and the year in which the architecture of what followed was being built, and I did not know it. She was 10 that year and had decided, with the seriousness she brought to all her decisions, to learn how the world worked. Not in the abstract way of children who ask philosophical questions and are satisfied with philosophical answers, but in the specific and physical way of someone who wants to understand mechanisms. She wanted to know how the hinge of a door worked and why water moved the way it did around obstacles and what the specific quality of morning light was called by people who knew things about light. She had been keeping her drawings for 2 years by then, the folder under her bed that she would take out and show me on certain evenings when she had made something new. The drawings were of the things she had observed and been trying to understand each one, accompanied by notes in the small, neat handwriting she had developed for the specific purpose of annotating her observations, separate from the handwriting she used for school. She showed me a drawing one evening in March of that year. It was a drawing of the canal near the park, the specific section where the current changed direction around a set of stones, and she had drawn the water in a way that showed the pattern of the movement, the specific curves and countercurrents produced by the obstacle. The drawing was accurate in a way that was remarkable for a 10-year-old. She had not just drawn what she saw, she had drawn what she understood about what she saw. I looked at it for a long time. She said, "Do you know what makes it do that, the water?" I said, "The water is moving at a constant speed, and when it hits the obstacle it has to go around it, but the obstacle is not symmetrical. So one side has more resistance than the other, which changes the direction of the flow on each side. And then, when the two flows rejoin, they produce a rotation." She looked at me. I said, "It is called turbulence." She said, "Turbulence." She wrote it in her notes. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours that evening. I explained everything I knew about fluid dynamics, which was not a great deal, but which was more than the average 13-year-old knew, because I had been reading broadly and specifically since I was 8 years old, in the way of someone who uses reading to manage the loneliness of institutional life. She listened with the complete attention she brought to things she was learning, and she asked questions. There were always the right questions, the questions that go to the next thing, rather than staying with the thing already explained. At the end of the 2 hours, she closed her notebook and looked at me with the expression she had when she had decided something. She said, "You know a lot of things." I said, "I have read a lot." She said, "No, that is different. Some people read a lot and they know facts. You have understood the things you read. That is different." I was 13 years old, and no one had said anything like this to me before. Not ever. The social workers wrote about my intelligence in the clinical way of people documenting a capacity. The teachers acknowledged my academic performance with the specific professional warmth of people whose job it is to acknowledge it. But no one had sat across a table from me and said, "You have understood things. That is different." I said nothing. I did not know how to respond to being seen accurately. She did not require a response. She put her notebook under her arm and went upstairs. I heard her door close, and then after a moment the sound of her at her desk writing. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at her drawing of the canal which she had left for me. I kept it. I put it in the folder I was beginning to keep of my own, a folder that I told myself was for things related to my studies, but that was, I understood even then, for something else. It is still there, in the drawer with the candy wrapper. Additional chapter, The Mistake About Claire. I want to tell you more about Claire because the account I gave earlier was accurate but incomplete. Claire Moreau was Isabel's closest friend in the years when they were 15 and 14, respectively. She was the daughter of an architect and a nurse, and she had the specific quality that the children of professionals in certain fields sometimes have, a directness that comes from being raised by people who deal in facts and who have not insulated their children from the factual quality of the world. She and Isabel found each other in the second year of secondary school over a shared outrage about something in a history textbook that had described a specific event in a way that both of them found inaccurate for different but complementary reasons. I know this because Isabel came home that evening and told me about it with the specific animated quality she had when she had found someone who understood things the way she understood them. She said, "There is a girl in my class. She argued with the teacher about the textbook, and she was right about the argument, but she was wrong about one of the supporting points, and I told her which point was wrong, and she agreed immediately." I said, "She agreed immediately." She said, without defending the point, she just said, "Yes, that is wrong," and we moved on to the next part of the argument. I said, "That is unusual." She said, "That is what I thought. Her name is Claire." I registered this. I registered the specific quality of how she described it, the animated warmth that I had not heard in her voice when she talked about other people at school. I catalogued it. Claire and Isabel spent 3 years being the specific kind of friends who sharpen each other. The friendship was genuinely good. I could see this from the person Isabel was becoming. In it, the specific ways her thinking was developing, the increasing precision of her observations, the growing confidence of her judgments. Claire was exactly the thing she needed, and I knew this clearly. And I managed her away anyway. Not in a single moment, over months, in the small ways I have described. The subtle shifts in availability, the atmosphere when they were together that was not quite comfortable, but that no one could point to as the cause. The specific question I asked Isabel once, after a day when Claire had challenged her on something she had said, whether she felt that Claire always trusted her instincts, or whether sometimes she felt her instincts were not being given the credit they deserved. A careful question, designed to land in a specific place. It landed. I am describing this in detail because the account of what I did requires the accounting of what it was, not just the broad shape of it, but the specific mechanism, the specific question placed at the specific time. The way I knew it would land, because I had been reading Isabel for 4 years, and I understood exactly where she was uncertain, and exactly how to place a doubt in that uncertainty in a way that would develop over time. Claire moved away from Isabel over the following months, not with any drama, not with any specific incident, through the slow drift of a friendship that has been made slightly less safe than it was, and that therefore settles into a more comfortable but less generative configuration. Isabel was sad about this. She said once that she felt like she and Claire had become less close, and she did not understand why. I said, "Sometimes people grow in different directions." She said, "Yes." I said, "The important thing is the people who remain." She looked at me. I said, "The people who have always been there." She was quiet for a moment. I watched her receive this and decide to accept it, and the receiving and accepting was the specific moment in which I understood what I had done clearly and completely and chose to continue. That is the moment I return to most often in the therapy, that moment of clarity and continuation, the moment in which I knew and went on. Additional chapter, the night before the accident. The night before my parents died on the road to Brittany, they were in the living room after dinner. I was in my room working on a clinical paper, but the walls of the apartment were thin enough that I could hear them without trying to. They were talking in the way they talked when they thought no one could hear them, in the low domestic register of two people who have been in a house together for 20 years and who have developed a frequency that exists only between them. They were talking about Isabel. I heard enough to understand the quality of the conversation, which was the quality of a conversation that had been happening intermittently for some time, and that was in this instance reaching something that had been approaching for a while. They were talking about the dynamic between Isabel and me, not with any specific accusation, with the specific cautious language of two people who have noticed something they do not have the full picture of and who are trying to name it carefully. Catherine said something about the way Isabel had fewer independent friendships than she used to. Philippe said something about whether that was natural at her age. Catherine said she did not think it was entirely natural and that she thought there was something about the dynamic with Lucien that was worth paying attention to. Philippe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will speak with him." Catherine said, "Not yet. Let us watch a while longer." The conversation moved on to something else. I sat in my room with my hands flat on the desk and I thought about what I'd heard. They had seen it. Not all of it. Not the specific mechanism, but the shape of it. Catherine especially. She was a musician and she heard things in the quality of interactions that other people missed the specific wrong note in a relationship that sounds almost right. I had 4 hours to think about what this meant, whether to change anything, whether to say something, whether to find a way to shift the situation before the conversation Philippe was going to have with me. Then the next morning the phone call came. I have thought about this many times since, about what would have happened if the accident had not happened, if Philippe had talked to me, if Catherine had kept watching, if I had been made to account for what I was doing before it had gone further. I do not know what would have happened. I know that the interruption of that accountability was one of the things that allowed everything after to occur. And I know that the interruption was an accident, which means no one caused it, which means I cannot hold anyone else responsible for the absence of the accountability. The absence of the accountability is not something anyone caused. The use I made of the absence is additional chapter, what treatment looks like. I have been in treatment for 14 months. My therapist is a man named Bernard, who is 62 years old, and who worked for 20 years with people who had been in various ways perpetrators of harm before moving to a position where he now works with both perpetrators and survivors of specific categories of harm. He chose this work. He did not find it by accident. He has a quality that I did not expect in the person treating me, which is the specific quality of someone who has decided not to divide the people in front of him into categories of deserving and undeserving. He does not treat me as though I am redeemable in any simple sense. He does not tell me that what I did was understandable or that my history explains it. He works with me in the way of someone building something from the ground up, not repairing a damaged structure, but understanding the specific nature of the foundation and whether it can hold anything. What the treatment looks like specifically, it looks like sitting with the thing without managing it. This is the first and the most persistent work. I have been managing things all my life. The continuous processing of experience through the specific filter of utility and threat assessment. The treatment is the practice of sitting with an experience without immediately doing anything with it, receiving it and letting it be received, and not converting it immediately into information to be filed. I am bad at this. I am getting slightly better. It looks like the specific labor of distinguishing between what I felt and what I did with what I felt. These are not the same thing, and I have spent years treating them as the same thing, treating the feeling as the action, and therefore not being fully responsible for the action, because it was the feeling acting, rather than me acting. Bernard calls this the mechanism, and he says, the mechanism is not you, but the mechanism is yours. It is something you built, which means it can be rebuilt differently. This is not absolution. It is simply an accurate description of the nature of the problem. It looks like the 11-year-old in the kitchen at midnight. I spend time there in the treatment, not in a sentimental way, in the specific way of someone trying to understand what that child understood correctly, because what he understood correctly was real, and the thing that went wrong was not the understanding, but everything that came after it. He understood there are people who give things without expecting return. This is available in the world. This is a real quality that exists in some people. He should have understood this quality when you encounter it requires a specific response that is not the response of someone who has never had it before and who is therefore afraid it can be taken. The correct response is not to protect it by controlling the person who embodies it. The correct response is to be present for it and to let it be what it is. He did not know the correct response because he had never been taught it, because the world he had been in up to that point did not contain the correct response as a lesson he had been given. He had to learn it on his own, and he did not learn it correctly. I am learning it now, 14 months in with Bernard in the 4th floor apartment with the courtyard and the rosemary. It is very slow. It is the right pace. Additional, chapter Isabel at 10. There is one more thing I want to put in this account. Isabel at 10 in the year I have described, the year of the drawings. She was working on a drawing one afternoon in November that was different from her other drawings. It was not an observation of a mechanism or a natural system. It was a drawing of a hand, a specific hand studied from life, the hand she had available which was her own, left hand, drawn from the angle available when you are drawing your own hand. It was very good, better than it should have been for a 10-year-old. She had drawn the specific curve of the knuckles, the way the tendons moved under the skin, when the fingers extended, the quality of the light falling on the back of the hand from the window. She showed it to me and said, "I'm trying to understand how it works." I said, "The hand." She said, "Everything, why things are the shape they are. If I can understand why a hand is the shape it is, maybe I can understand other things." I looked at the drawing. I said, "The hand is the shape it is, because it evolved to grip things and to make fine movements. The curve of the knuckles is for strength. The specific arrangement of the tendons allows both power and precision at the same time." She said, "That is amazing. That something can be designed for both power and precision." I said, "It is not designed, it evolved." She said, "But evolution is a kind of design. The design just took longer." I sat with this. She was 10 years old and she had just said something that was genuinely true in a way that had not occurred to me and that reorganized something in how I was thinking about the question. She said, "What do you think is the hardest thing to design for both power and precision?" I said, "Relationships." She looked at me. I said, "Relationships need to be strong enough to hold when things are difficult and precise enough to see the other person accurately. Most relationships are better at one than the other." She thought about this. She said, "Which are you better at?" I was 13 and I did not know the answer. I looked at the drawing of the hand. I said, "I do not know yet." She said, "I think you are better at precision." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you always know exactly what is happening with people. You always know." I said, "Is that a good thing?" She said, with the directness she always had, "It depends what you do with the knowing." She went back to her drawing. I sat with what she had said. 13 years old, she had told me everything. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. It depends what you do with the knowing. The Brother Who Was Not My Brother is an original dramatic narrative set in Lyon and Paris, France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or to actual organizations or events is entirely coincidental. Additional, chapter the response. She responded to my letter, not immediately. 3 months after I sent it, a letter arrived at the apartment, addressed to Lucien Voss, in handwriting I recognized. I did not open it for 2 days, because I needed to be in the right state to receive whatever it contained, which required the specific kind of preparation that is not management, but is the clearing of space. I opened it on a Sunday morning. It is 3 paragraphs. I am not going to tell you everything it says because it belongs to her and to me and to the specific private exchange between 2 people who have been in each other's lives for 15 years and are now doing the hardest thing, which is continuing in the only form that continuing is possible. She said, "I am reading the letter carefully. I am not going to tell you that I believe everything in it or that reading it was comfortable. But I'm going to tell you that I believe you understood something true on the night of the first snow and that what you understood was real and that I am glad I brought you that candy." She said, "I have been thinking about what you said about the architecture, about not having the architecture to hold what you understood correctly. I am a person who has been studying architecture for most of my life, in the literal sense and in every other sense, the study of how things are built and what holds and what fails. I understand the problem of a structure built from the wrong materials. It does not mean the design was wrong. It means the materials need to change." She said, "I am not offering you reconciliation. I am not in a position to offer you that, and I do not know if I ever will be. What I am offering is this. The thing that started with the candy was real. Both things can be true. I am working on holding both things at once. You should work on it too." I folded the letter. I put it in the drawer. I sat at the desk in the Sunday morning with the western light coming through the window and the rosemary visible in the pot across the courtyard. She had said the design was not wrong. I am not in a position to evaluate this claim. The treatment says it is not my job to evaluate it. My job is to rebuild the architecture from better materials and to understand that whatever was true and real in the beginning is not invalidated by what the wrong architecture did to it. The truth of the beginning is not reducible to the error of what came after. I do not know if this is correct. Bernard thinks it is worth working toward. I am working toward it. The candy wrapper is in the drawer. The letter is beside it now. Both things are there. Additional, chapter, what the rosemary is for. I have been watching the man tend the rosemary in the courtyard for 11 months. He comes out on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and sometimes on Sunday afternoons when the light is right. He brings a small watering can and a pair of scissors, and he moves around the pot with the specific patient attentiveness of someone for whom the tending is the point. I asked him once through the open window what he was growing. He said rosemary. I said, what for? He looked up at me. He was perhaps 70, with the specific quality of old men who have been outdoors much of their lives, the weathered and unhurried quality. He said, for the smell of it. It smells like a hillside in Provence in summer. I grew up on a hillside in Provence. My wife grew up there too. She died 4 years ago. He looked at the rosemary. He said, I grow it because it smells like where we were from. That is all. I said, that is a good reason. He said, it does not have to have more reasons than that. He went back to the tending. I stood at the window and I thought about things you keep because of what they smell like rather than for any useful purpose. Things that smell like where you are from. The specific and irrational faithfulness of someone who waters a pot of rosemary on Tuesday and Friday mornings because of what it smells like and because of who he grew up with on the hillside it smells of. That is a form of love that I had not previously had a name for. I do not have a name for it still, but I recognize it now when I see it. That is the architecture I'm learning to build. Not the management, not the possession, not the chain. The Tuesday and Friday mornings, the smell of a hillside, the knowing that some things are kept simply because they are worth keeping, and keeping them does not require the thing to remain in your possession, only the memory of it to remain in your attention. This is what I am working toward. It is the right direction. I am going. Additional chapter, the parallel story. There is something I have been circling around in this account and that I need to address directly because the circling is itself a form of management, and I am trying to stop managing. Isabel is rebuilding her life. I know this not from surveillance. I have not surveilled her since the day she left, but from the periodic information that reaches me through the legal process and through the treatment which requires that I understand the consequences of what I did to someone's life. I know she is in an apartment somewhere in Paris. I know she has connected again slowly with people from her life before. I know she has read my letter and responded to it. I think about this parallel story, the story she is living on her side of the distance between us. And I try to think about it without making it about me, without folding it into the account of my own development and my own learning and my own process. She is a separate person. She has always been a separate person. The error I made was treating her as an extension of what I needed, rather than as a person with her own story that was not organized around me. Her story is hers. I do not have the right to narrate it. What I can say is that the fact of her separate story continuing is something I hold every morning when I'm at the desk with the Western light, not as possession, not as the knowing that something is still there that belongs to me, as the knowledge that the person who gave me the candy is still in the world and is still the person who gave it, which is a thing that happened and that cannot be unmade and that does not belong to either of us in the sense of ownership, but that belongs to the story of both of us in the sense of what we have been to each other. She gave me the candy. I took 14 years to understand what it meant. I am using the understanding now. It is the only thing I can do with it that honors it. Additional chapter Bernard. I want to tell you about one session with Bernard. It was in the 3rd month of treatment. I had been describing, as I did most sessions, the specific mechanism of what I had done, the patient accumulation of small actions that had produced the large result with the clinical precision of someone documenting a system. Bernard listened for 20 minutes. Then he put his pen down. He said, Lucien. I said, yes. He said, you have described the mechanism accurately and completely. You understand how it worked better than most people understand mechanisms they have deployed. Is there something else here? I said, what do you mean? He said, you describe the mechanism the way you describe mechanisms in general, accurately and from the outside. Is there something you have not described? I said, I've described everything. He said, you have described what you did. You have not described what it felt like. I was quiet. He said, not the feeling that produced the mechanism. You have described that, the feeling underneath the feeling, the thing that the mechanism was protecting. I said, I do not know what you mean. He said, I think you do. We sat in the silence for a while. I said, the candy. He said, tell me. I said, the night of the candy, I was 11 and she was 8 and she brought me a piece of candy she had been saving for 11 months and she did not want anything back for it. He said, what did that feel like? I said, I did not have a word for it. He said, try. I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, like being seen without being assessed, like someone had looked directly at me and not found anything to be afraid of or careful about, just looked and then done something kind. He said, yes. I said, that does not exist. That is not a thing that exists in the world. He said, you mean it had not existed in your world? I said, yes. He said, What did you do when it turned out to exist? I said I was afraid it would stop existing. He said yes. I said, so I tried to make it permanent. He said yes. I said, and in trying to make it permanent, I destroyed the thing that made it what it was. He said yes. He picked up his pen. He did not write anything for a moment. He said, the 11-year-old who received the candy was not wrong about what he received. He was not wrong to want more of it. He was not wrong to organize himself around it. The error was in the method. I said the method. He said the wrong architecture. I said yes. He said, so the work is not to stop wanting the thing, the work is to want it correctly. I sat with this for the rest of the session and for several days after, wanting it correctly. Not the management, not the possession, not the prevention of loss, the wanting without the possession. The Tuesday and Friday mornings. The rosemary, the receiving of the gift the first time without immediately beginning the work of ensuring there will be a next time. That is the work. It is a very long work. I am doing it. N. The Brother Who Was Not My Brother is an original dramatic narrative set in Lyon and Paris, France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual organizations or events is entirely coincidental.